Okay, so today for this session, we're joined by Amy Marty Conrad, who serves as the Managing Director for programs at NEFE. If any of you are in the financial education realm, you've heard of NEFE, but she's been with the organization for the last 7 years. Currently oversees several of the high school financial planning programs with a focus on developing strategies to help educators and partners nationwide build a more effective financial education class and program. We are joined today also by Raven Newberry, who's the Senior Manager for Programs at NEFE. She's been with the organization for the last 6 years and currently supports their college program called CashCourse. In addition to helping guide curriculum web development of NEFE programs, Raven develops onboarding and training materials for NEFE school partners. The last thing I will make note before I turn it over to Amy and Raven is that NEFE's mission is that it champions effective financial education. They are the independent, centralizing voice, providing leadership, research, and collaboration to advance financial well-being. So I'm going to turn it over to both you, Amy and Raven. In the interest of time, I know we have just a small allocation of it, so I don't want to take too much of it. So Amy, Raven, over to you.
Great. Thank you, James, for those lovely introductions. So, hi, Financial Beginnings, staff and board. We were really thrilled to be invited to share our presentation, Right-Sizing Expectations, Making Sense of the Personal Finance Ecosystem with you all, and getting your responses and reactions to this framework we've developed. So I just have a few housekeeping notes before we get started. This presentation, as James said, is being recorded, and I've also shared the slide deck with James, so please note you'll have both of those on hand for reference, so take notes as you might, but know that those will be available to you. I know we're tight on time today, but feel free to enter any questions you have into the chat, and we'll try to get to them as time permits. But please know both Amy and I will be available to answer any questions you have going forward after today's presentation. So with that said, I'll go ahead and get started. So before we introduce ourselves, I do want to share a little bit more about the National Endowment for Financial Education. It is pronounced NEFE in acronym form, which is surprising to a lot of people. So James, you got that correct. So we're a nonprofit, non-commercial, independent foundation based in Denver, Colorado. And although we're based in Denver, we do have a national facing mission, which, as James said, is championing effective financial education. So we do that through 3 areas of focus: research, education, and awareness. The personal finance ecosystem we're going to be presenting on today was developed by our research team. So I'm Raven Newberry, and I'm the Senior Manager of Programs here at NEFE. Again, thank you, James, for the lovely introduction, and I'll go ahead and turn it over to Amy to kick off today's presentation.
All right, thanks, Raven. So I'm Amy Marty Conrad, the Managing Director of Programs at NEFE. I'm very happy to be presenting the financial education ecosystem model for you all. I am going to turn my own video off just to make sure my internet connection stays stable and my audio is good, but I can pop back on at the end if we have questions. All right. So our purpose today is to take you through NEFE's personal finance ecosystem model. This is an approach we've used to make sense of some of the complexity around the components of financial well-being. So what the model does is lay out the foundations of financial wellness for individuals, and then it also shows how elements in the world of personal finance work together to create financial well-being. So we find the ecosystem really useful in setting realistic expectations for what you should be able to achieve with different methods of education, information, behavioral influencers, and other efforts like that. So the ecosystem can bring value to practitioners and professionals for a few different reasons. This model can show you where your work fits in relation to a client or a learner's overall financial life, and it can be useful in considering where a partnership might be advantageous. It's also very useful for framing discussions about impact, outcomes, and results, especially as you're designing a program. Ideally, this would help you communicate with leadership and stakeholders about the way that what you do contribute to program success and hopefully prevent some unrealistic expectations or misunderstandings. So first, I'm going to show you the ecosystem overall, and then I'm going to break down each of the elements within it. So right now we're looking at 2 versions of the personal finance ecosystem, and don't worry about the slide being short and brief. I know there's a lot to take in. So this model was originally developed about 2 years ago by NEFE's Vice President of Research and Programs, the economist Dr. Catherine Sauer. So we are currently on version 2 of this model. You'll see our original version, version 1 here on the left. Version 2 is where we are right now, and we are working on a revision, version 3, which I think is going to debut sort of in the new year. But at each stage of this model, we've solicited feedback from others in the field of financial well-being. And so that's why we made this change from version 1 to version 2. So this tool is meant to be helpful in discussion, but it's definitely something that's evolving, and criticism has been really helpful for us. And in the use, like the criticism is part of the usefulness of the model itself for the field. So I'll take you through version 2 now, the triangle pictured here over the next few slides. And I'm also going to talk about some of the changes that we see coming in version 3. So what we have here in the center pyramid are the components contributing to an individual's financial well-being. Those are surrounded by the external influences. And then each external influence points to the area that it impacts in the individual's life. There is a lot here, so I'll take it section by section and just explain all these interplays. So the first thing we have here are the elements making up financial well-being for the individual. This is not a hierarchy, even though it's presented as a pyramid. Rather, each item here is something that we all experience all the time to one degree or another. So for example, your critical thinking skills are listed alongside general skills and abilities. These could be high, low, somewhere in the middle. You always possess them, no matter what. So the same is true for financial well-being. We all have a current level of financial well-being. It's not a single endpoint, something you have or you don't have. Well-being is something that is self-described and self-assessed, and it can change over time. So usually well-being includes things like your satisfaction with how you're managing your present situation, whether you feel you have choices or have some control over what's happening in your life, and how you feel about the future for yourself. So as I said at the beginning, we all have financial well-being, and the high or low level of that perceived well-being is impacted by these other elements in the pyramid. So while well-being is something that you define for yourself, the financial actions that you take and the results of those like taking a job, pursuing education, or starting a family. And so when you take an action or make a decision, it results in an outcome or a set of outcomes. And outcomes can be things we can objectively measure, like the impact on a credit score. Outcomes can also be subjective, like how confident you feel in that decision you just made.
Just want to check in. Are y'all hearing Amy? I've lost her audio.
Income has gone up because of that. Oh,
I don't hear Amy.
Hi, I'm back. Do you hear me now?
Yeah, yes.
Sorry about that. Would you like me to start this slide over?
That might be helpful. Sorry, I was skipping through the slides because I lost where you were, but yes, if you could do this one and then we'll take off from there.
No problem. I'm sorry about that. So we'll start over. So well-being is something that you define for yourself. The actions you take play a large part in that well-being. So when you make a decision, whether it's big or it's small, like a daily purchase, I'm buying a coffee, versus a really large decision like I'm going to buy a new house or I'm going to have a child. Whenever you make a decision or you take an action, that results in an outcome or a set of outcomes, whether objective, like an outcome on your credit score, or a subjective outcome, like how good you feel about the decision you just made. We also experience outcomes from shocks that happen to you outside of the actions that you take yourself. Things like a negative shock would be, the tire went flat on my car, I have to buy a new tire. Or a positive shock could be, I got a raise, and so now I'm making a little bit more money. And so there's this ongoing relationship between the actions and the outcomes, and how you feel about them, or that subjective impact they have on your situation, feeds into well-being. So the fine print around decisions and actions are a person's idiosyncratic factors. It's important to note these because decisions and actions rarely happen in a purely rational way, and every individual brings this mental landscape into the decision-making process that shapes how they act. Idiosyncratic factors are things like attitudes, values, stress, risk tolerance. So for example, a person who attaches a lot of personal fulfillment to their career might make a different employment decision than someone who really values flexibility or who really values highly stable employment. So those are all values that are going to influence the decision making. There isn't a right or wrong way to make this choice. It's just a factor that's going to feed into the elements that go into the decision. Idiosyncrasies are also influential on how willing or able you are to learn and have your behavior influenced by different interventions. So all these things that are swimming around in your brain, they are going to be part of the equation that makes up how much education, information, other interventions are going to impact you. So then the in well-being is financial capability. So NEFE defines this as the person's ability to act in their own best interest, and their best interest is something that they define for themselves. There are two primary things that make up capability in our view. One is the knowledge and know-how to act. So this is financial literacy, take an action. So by access. If you have one without the other, overall capability lower. So if, say, you have lots of financial savvy, but you're in a banking desert or you have no credit history, that would create a lower level of capability for yourself. Or if you have access to a ton of great products, but you don't have the ability or know how to choose among them, you'd also have lower capability. Capability has an impact on the actions a person can take and therefore on the outcomes that they experience. The final layer in well-being are what we refer to as foundational factors. And these are the basic internal skills and abilities you possess, like critical thinking or problem solving. They're not directly related to financial choices. They're not financial in nature, but you use them as a way to build knowledge and make other decisions. External factors like the economy, cultural factors, systematic inequality, and so on are also highly influential in financial capability and on the ability to make decisions. So they're certainly important to overall well-being. So you see them all stacked up here. And as a reminder, everybody experiences these elements all the time. So everyone has a current level of financial well-being. Everyone's making financial decisions. Everyone's experiencing outcomes. Everyone has a current level of financial capability, and everyone is impacted by their own general skills and abilities and by external factors. Then back to well-being, which is what this is all about. Well-being shifts based on a really complex combination of all the other elements in the pyramid. And it's not a perfect science where we can exactly predict the impact of a change to any one of these factors on the rest of the pyramid. I mean, you could try a thought experiment in some of these areas. So you could think about what happens, say, with a significant external factor change, for example, like a new regulation. So there would be some financial ripple effect from that regulation on people's capability, on their actions, on the outcomes they experience, and then therefore their well-being. You could just, make up one in your mind and play it out and see how it might impact someone. Or perhaps a change in values as life circumstances change. So if you're going to college and you start as a freshman, your values that you bring to the table in decision-making might look really different as an incoming freshman versus when you're a graduating senior. So now we're talking about some of these impacts on the well-being pyramid themselves, those external influencers. So broadly speaking, we group activities that impact individuals into two categories: behavior influencers and knowledge influencers. Knowledge influencers have an effect on financial capability, while behavior influencers impact actual decisions and actions. So I'm going to dive a little deeper into these now. So we define knowledge influencers as engagements that have the purpose of increasing a person's financial knowledge and skills, or to inform them about a specific and narrow topic. So financial information includes tools, resources, and activities that inform the individual about a topic or a decision. And then financial education, we define similarly to other educational disciplines. So that would be the systematic approach to cultivating financial knowledge and financial decision-making skills. So education implies that we're using appropriate pedagogy, that we have learning outcomes and assessment techniques, and that whatever intervention we're performing is adequate in length so that that learner could incorporate the knowledge into what they already know or what they can do. Information, on the other hand, is comprised of things like one-off lessons, articles, blogs, tips and tricks, checklists, decision aids. So you can use information and tools as part of education, but on their own, they're not education in and of themselves. So there's quite a lot of financial information out in the environment being marketed as financial education. So we think it's important to differentiate the two. They're both useful and they both have their place, but they have different impacts and they serve different purposes. And then switching over to behavior influencers, we define these as interventions with the purpose of helping someone make a specific decision or take a desired behavior. So an example here would be financial coaching, those one-on-one, coaching relationships towards a specific goal, some fintech innovations, apps that guide you towards a certain savings behavior, for example. They target behavior specifically and not knowledge. So it's possible for one of these interventions to impact your behavior without imparting any lasting knowledge on the individual. If you're using an app that, say, rounds up every purchase to the nearest dollar to save, well, that's helping you with a specific behavior, but you may or may not learn anything or learn anything lasting within that process. And surrounding the ecosystem itself is research, evaluation, and policy. Research helps to build our understanding of how elements in the ecosystem relate to one another. And through research, we can measure each element. We can identify the directions of influence on the channels, the feedback loops. We can quantify the barriers, and it can quantify the overall impact of influencers and policy. Assessments and evaluations then verify, validate, and show areas for improvement in our interventions. An assessment should be appropriate for the outcomes and objectives that we've set prior to our educational or behavioral engagements. The evaluation's purpose is to see if the inputs and activities of our programs result in the intended outputs and outcomes. That's part of why the ecosystem relationships are helpful, is you can better know what the relationships are between interventions and an individual, so you could select the right assessment tool or set yourself up for evaluation. And I'll briefly touch on policy. I won't dig much into that. I know we're using up lots of our time. Beyond just consumer protections, policy shapes who has influence, how general education is managed and financed, how it's supported and executed. Policy has an impact on external factors like the economy, and it contributes to access and outcomes. So for example, something like the presence and availability of something like Social Security or SNAP benefits. Those are driven or supported by policy, and they have an impact on what sort of access people have, what sort of resources people have. So I know that was a lot. Our hope is that knowing about this model is going to help put your work in context of a learner or a client or our general society's larger financial life. And it's also a way to put parameters around our work and develop some realistic outcomes that we're trying to achieve. We think this could be a useful way to identify where you might want to develop a partnership and just to think through, what work are we doing or what work are we supporting that would fit within this model. And now I will turn it over to Raven.
Thank you, Amy. I'll go ahead and close us out. So just like an investment portfolio should be diverse, financial well-being really does require diverse supports. So all these methods and tools factor into an individual's financial well-being, and it's important to recognize this and not pit approaches against one another. So for instance, financial education shouldn't occur at the expense of consumer protections or vice versa. So as financial well-being advocates, we should really use all the tools in the toolbox. So the impact of knowledge influencers are affected by their quality, dose, and delivery. Quality is affected by factors like the presence of explicit learning or behavior objectives or something like a trained facilitator. Dose is the length of exposure and should be considered when setting program objectives. And then delivery includes factors like interactivity and the level of feedback offered throughout a program. So it's important to keep these factors in mind when planning for educational outcomes and managing expectations for a program. So those outside of the field, and often those of us working within it, may have outsized expectations for what the influences, educational behavior, et cetera, can achieve. So we don't expect our high school health class, if we were even lucky enough to have one, to keep us healthy for our whole lives. And it's helpful to keep a similar lens with financial education. So here's what financial education can't do. Financial education itself is not a solution to poverty or the economic crisis. It can't negate systemic biases such as anything like race, gender, national origin, ability, and it can't magically provide more resources to the under-resourced. But here's what financial education can do. It can help individuals make the best of their personal situation. It can help protect them against fraud and other bad actors. And it's a really powerful complement to consumer protections. And it can help individuals assess products and services available to them. So financial education programs can really make a bigger impact by considering what partnerships they could do with complementary initiatives that fill other roles in the ecosystem. For instance, food pantries for those facing food insecurity, or partnering with credit unions for things like financial tools and services. We also recommend organizations to consider how their own work may actually cover multiple roles within the ecosystem. This is an example from higher education, but many campus student money management centers offer both financial education and distribute things like emergency grants, so fulfilling two different areas of the ecosystem. So I'm going to read this for emphasis. Even the highest quality, perfectly dosed and delivered influence will be mediated by other elements within the ecosystem. So we really try to emphasize this. Financial education is a critical part of financial well-being, but we would be remiss to not acknowledge this reality with our work. So as Amy mentioned, we have received feedback from the field that will be incorporated into the next version of the model, which will be the third. We do hope to release that around the new year. So we'd be happy to send that on to you all if you're interested in seeing that. You could also find it at nefe.org. So a couple of feedback that I want to highlight that we will be changing going forward. One, the pyramid understandably conveys a strong hierarchy between the elements, which is somewhat misleading for what we're trying to convey. So every individual has some level of these elements at all times. So our next version that graphic representation will better represent that interplay and that iterative relationship. We also heard from the field that the idiosyncratic factors impact more than just behaviors and decisions. So in our next model, those will be present as foundational factors. And if you have any feedback on this model, please let us know. We really appreciate thoughts and contributions. And as Amy said earlier, the field response has really helped us refine this model and make sure it's something useful to those who are doing financial education and operating in this space. So some final takeaways. Yes, the problems are complex. The ecosystem really demonstrates this. However, this framework is helpful in setting boundaries around what you are and are not trying to impact, and where you can and cannot see results, expect to see results, and where partnerships or areas of cooperation might expand your efforts and amplify your impact. So it's important to remember we are all part of the solution. So thank you so much for this opportunity to share this framework with you all, and thank you all for your good work in the field at Financial Beginnings. We do have some time remaining, so we'd be happy to field any questions you might have. So happy to enter those into the chat, or feel free to unmute yourself and ask your questions yourself. Amy and I will be on to answer anything you might have.
Thank you both so much. That was super informative. I have a question. I'm curious if you have seen other financial education providers in your sphere that are having sort of a similar challenge that we're having, where we have curriculum that's rooted in a certain, like you mentioned, adequate duration, but a lot of our education and community-based organization partners don't necessarily have the time or bandwidth to open up their classrooms or community centers to full-length presentations. And so we have this struggle with this push-pull of trying to give, of course, as much financial education as possible, but also trying to be really responsive to the needs of the community. I'm wondering if you've seen that across your ecosystem, and how you've, what sort of advice or expertise you've given to other financial education providers.
I mean, shelf space is obviously a perennial problem. Especially, you know, we work a lot with high schools, and getting a small time frame is sometimes better than nothing. I can't speak in depth to that, like carving out space and time necessarily. I think a good positive direction would be to be realistic about what the program itself can deliver in the time that's there, in the time that we do have. So, you know, don't promise, you know, a lasting, you know, 10 years worth of impact on a 1 hour presentation, for example. And I not that to imply that that's happening. It's just being okay with what's within our control and what we can influence now, and then working to carve out space as it becomes available. I think right now is particularly challenging because in a time of crisis, you know, this is the rainy day where we're trying to say, like, what is the critical thing to do for folks now? Is it access to resources? Is it these other things in the ecosystem beyond education? It's very, very hard to say. I mean, that's the thing we struggle with all the time. Teachers don't have the time to teach this material, even at the college level. Oftentimes it's opt-in for students who, and many of them will not opt in. I don't think we have one clear solution to this. Raven, I don't know if you can speak to any examples from higher ed that might come to mind.
Yeah, just to reiterate, this is definitely a problem with both high school and at the college space, just carving out that time to teach. I think I've seen some success with programs really measuring and evaluating the impact of what they've done to say, like, hey, this has value, and you'll get more results if we have more time with these students. And then, of course, as Amy said, setting realistic expectations for what something like an hour workshop will do. We see at the college space, sometimes it's like an hour workshop on budgeting is then measured by how many students like complete the FAFSA, which is two completely different things. So really managing expectations for what should be evaluated for what you're doing can really demonstrate, you know, if you want a lasting impact, we'll need more time. But it's definitely a challenge.
Awesome. Thank you. That's really helpful.
Amy, Raven, thank you so much. This is more of a comment than it is a question. We've been using this model, you know, to help refine or attempt to refine our curriculum. And we found it very helpful, in particular, trying to rein in what we can realistically accomplish and what realistically the impact that we can make. And so, you know, I think we've leveled down our evaluation, or we're in the process of leveling down our evaluation to make it a little bit more realistic, to be in that kind of financial capability space, rather than, you know, assuming or claiming that we're impacting behaviors on that bigger level, especially when there's other factors at play. And so I really like that you're highlighting the need for partnerships. I think that's really, really great. And it's something that I think that certainly at the FBUSA, the national level, we can improve on. I know at the ground level with Oregon and California, Nebraska, Washington, there's partnerships that are being made with community-based organizations that are kind of speaking to that partnership. But it's definitely something at the national level that we can pursue even more. But I thank you for your time and presenting the model. I've been reading it and studying it for the last couple of years, or however long it's been around. It seems like that's about how much time. And we found it very useful. So thank you for presenting it.
Well, thank you very much. I'm glad to hear that you're getting good use out of the information. And then whenever the newest version comes out with all these revisions, hopefully it will continue to be helpful.
Amy and Raven, my question, and thank you again, just echoing what everyone else has said about helping us out here today and sharing kind of the knowledge content. But as you are personally working with educators and partners nationwide, either at the high school or college level, as they're kind of building out a more effective, you know, financial education class and/or program, what kind of challenges are you hearing on their end? I know you mentioned some time, carving out time was one. Like, where are the teachers currently kind of compiling their information from as they're kind of pushing out the programs to their students? Are you able to kind of provide insight on some of that kind of starting point, the challenges, the obstacles, and kind of how you help to get them to a better place?
So when it comes to teachers, I think what's nice is that especially like high school K-12 classroom teachers come to the table with this extensive training in pedagogy. Like they know how learners learn, they know how to engage with students, they know what their local classroom is like and who's in the room. And so at a national level, when you're creating curriculum, having that local lens for us is tough. You know, we want to make some material and resources and support that is applicable to as many people as possible and is providing good guidelines and parameters around the work folks are doing. But, you know, at the local level, it's understanding what is relevant and timely for students that teachers really excel at. So I know that, you know, in this classroom, I have a lot of students who, you know, maybe it's a rural school and a lot of folks are in like an agricultural industry. Like we have a lens of like what the economics of this area are like and what students might be living with day to day. I feel like I just got on an anecdote and forgot part of your question, but so I think what we think about is like the relevance to the student. You know, personal finance is personal for a reason, right? So it's one of the only, I say this, maybe it's an exaggeration, it's a discipline where you can take what you're learning and apply it immediately to your life. And so being able to design or select resources that the student can then go out and do something with, I think is very key, especially for young adults. You know, young folks do have a financial perspective one way or another. They've been observing their community and their families. They've been listening to their teachers. You know, they hear things in the news. And so taking the perspective of what can someone do now with this information, and then how will that lesson, like that lived lesson, help support them into designing a future or their future financial lives, that's something we see as really important. You know, that immediate relevance, culturally competent material. And so for teachers, you know, we say it's totally fine to put together your lesson plan with what the students actually need. You know, it's fine to use that knowledge you have as an educator and to structure your lessons. And then, you know, obviously looking at accurate, relevant information that's up to date, you know, that plays within the financial reality, you know, that we live in, it's not outdated, all that's very important. But that localization and that personalization, I mean, as far as you can take that I think is where a lot of the change can live. Raven, I don't know if you wanted to add anything.
I think that was great, and that's definitely a challenge at both the college and the high school space, is just making sure it's relevant to students so it can actually make an impact. And then at the college level, I'd say a unique challenge we see our educators face there is colleges have a real incentive to prevent students from, you know, defaulting on student loans. So they'll come to financial education looking at it as a retention tool, and it's just making sure that the programs and lessons actually might impact that, and frequently they're disconnected. I used the budgeting and FAFSA example earlier. So we really try to help support our college educators with sort of navigating those leadership communication challenges to make sure the work they're doing is in line with expectations.
One other thing I think we see in our field is the prevalence of well-meaning volunteers who may not yet be equipped to teach the subject matter. And so that's an area we definitely see as potential for support, you know, is in good teacher training, if it's K-12, you know, on the subject matter itself of personal finance, but to help support people through partnerships or other engagements with someone who feels comfortable answering questions on the subject matter itself. So especially in higher ed, we often have folks who say financial aid is their primary discipline, or student support services. They're often not faculty, they're often in a support role. And so they know, again, they know how to support students, but maybe they get asked a technical question about a topic that someone wants to know about, you know, like this is happening in my life, you know, how does that impact my financial aid, you know, and they can point them to someone professional, and that's helpful. But when they're thinking of an overall, like, how am I going to help this person be successful post-graduation, it can be very intimidating to take that on as the volunteer or as someone who it's a portion of their time and not their full job. So supporting practitioners and educators is always going to be something we want to do, but it's definitely relevant, I think, in both K-12, but definitely in the adult higher education, you know, general financial world.
Another question I have is, with some states mandating financial education at the high school level, are you kind of seeing on your end, as you're working with educators and partners alike, that there's a noticeable difference between educators coming from those mandated states versus the others coming from other states. That like, is there a noticeable like contrast to either the questions they ask, the help they need, or the resources they already have and what they ask for in that sense?
Honestly, I don't see a huge difference with what people come to us with questions wise. I think one nice thing about this field is there is a lot of passion for it for the people who choose to teach the material and engage with it. I mean, of course, some folks it's, you know, required as part of either their discipline based on what's required at the state level. And I don't know, it's mostly people asking for good resources that are useful, that are easy to use, and flexible enough so that they can decide to use them how it fits in their classroom or in their district. Alignment to state standards obviously is something, and at least in our world of like resource creators and providers, that's always a question. You know, how does this align to either state or national standards for social studies or math or economics or wherever it tends to live. But really, I have not yet seen play out exactly, at least in the like curriculum and resource world, how a mandate is different from our lens, you know, with the teachers who are teaching.
Have you addressed how confidence fits into this? You know, is it, you know, more in that foundational factors, or is it, you know, as part of that financial capabilities and how confident one feels to take those actions?
Yeah, I mean, in the model, I don't think we call out confidence specifically. And we definitely, I think in the evaluation world, you know, evaluation and assessment, oftentimes knowledge, behavior, and competence are the three that we evaluate the impact of any of these interventions on. The knowledge and know-how to decide to act is part of capability. And so, you know, that's actual knowledge, but like confidence plays into your ability to exact your decisions. You know, if you feel unsure, how able are you to act and apply the knowledge that you have? I mean, it varies. I don't know if there's like a 1 to 10, how confident are you that we could point to and say it's like the magic number to help someone fully realize their financial, you know, financial opportunities that they have available to them. But I do know that confidence is, and I know Carly, Dr. Urban just spoke right before us. Knowledge, behavior, and confidence, I think, is obviously something we track constantly. And it's going to vary intervention to intervention, but I think it's implied in the model, but maybe not explicitly called out, and that could be somewhere where we could improve.
Great. Are there any other questions or comments from the Financial Beginnings staff and or board? All right. Well, I think I will speak for everyone and just thank you, Amy. Thank you, Raven, for taking the time to connect with all of us today. I know it was a lot of to digest, at least for me. I'll speak personally for me, because the difference between financial capability, well-being, and et cetera. So it's definitely an area that I will admit I'm weak in, but I'm glad they're a resource for me to get stronger at, or maybe I'll reach out to Tim because he's been reading this for a few years now. But shortly after the PD today, I'll make sure to send out the recording along with the slides, as well as the contact info for both Amy and Raven. But again, just thank you both for your time with us today, and then hope you have a great rest of your day.
Well, thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Yeah. And then for the Financial Beginnings staff and board, let's go ahead and go back on mute and Mike, and then we'll see you at top of the hour.